Chapter 1, Section 1 of the Greek View of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. Chapter 1. The Greek View of Religion. Section 1. Introductory. In approaching the subject of the religion of the Greeks, it is necessary to dismiss at the outset many of the associations which we are naturally inclined to connect with that word. What we commonly have in our mind when we speak of religion is a definite set of doctrines of a more or less metaphysical character, formulated in a creed and supported by an organisation distinct from the state. And the first thing we have to learn about the religion of the Greeks is that it included nothing of the kind. There was no church, there was no creed, there were no articles. There was no doctrine even, unless we are so to call a chaos of legends, orally handed down and in continual process of transformation by the poets. Priests there were, but they were merely public officials, appointed to perform certain religious rites. The distinction between cleric and layman, as we know it, did not exist. The distinction between poetry and dogma did not exist. And whatever the religion of the Greeks may have been, one thing at any rate is clear, that it was something very different from all that we are in the habit of associating with the word. What then was it? It is easy to reply that it was the worship of those gods, of Zeus, Apollo, Athene, and the rest, with whose names and histories everyone is familiar. But the difficulty is to realise what was implied in the worship of these gods, to understand that the mythology which we regard merely as a collection of fables was to the Greeks actually true, or at least that to 9 Greeks out of 10 it would never occur that it might be false, might be, as we say, mere stories. So that though no doubt the histories of the gods were in part the inventions of the poets, yet the poets would conceive themselves to be merely putting into form what they and everyone believed to be essentially true. But such a belief implies a fundamental distinction between the conception, or rather perhaps the feeling of the Greeks about the world, and our own. And it is this feeling that we want to understand when we ask ourselves the question, what did a belief in the gods really mean to the ancient Greeks? To answer it fully and satisfactorily is perhaps impossible, but some attempt must be made, and it may help us in our quest if we endeavour to imagine the kind of questionings and doubts which the conception of the gods would set at rest. End of chapter 1, section 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. 1, Section 2 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 1, Section 2. Greek Religion, an Interpretation of Nature. When we try to conceive the state of mind of primitive man, the first thing that occurs to us is the bewilderment and terror he must have felt in the presence of the powers of nature. Naked, houseless, weaponless, he is at the mercy every hour of this immense and incalculable something, so alien and so hostile to himself. As fire, it burns; as water, it drowns; as tempest, it harries and destroys. Benignant it may be at times, in warm sunshine and calm, but the kindness is brief and treacherous. Anyhow, whatever its mood, it has to be met and dealt with. By its help, or if not in the teeth of its resistance, every step in advance must be won. Every hour, every minute, it is there to be reckoned with. What is it then, this persistent, obscure, unnameable thing? What is it? The question haunts the mind. It will not be put aside, and the Greek at last, like other men under similar conditions, only with a lucidity and precision peculiar to himself, makes the reply, "It is something like myself." Every power of nature he presumes to be a spiritual being, impersonating the sky as Zeus, the earth as Demeter, the sea as Poseidon. From generation to generation, under his shaping hands, the figures multiply and define themselves. Character and story crystallise about what at first were little more than names, till at last, from the womb of the dark enigma that haunted him in the beginning, there emerges into the charmed light of a world of ideal grace a pantheon of fair and concrete personalities. Nature has become a company of spirits. Every cave and fountain is haunted by a nymph. In the ocean dwell the Nereids; in the mountain the Oread; the Dryad in the wood; and everywhere, in groves and marshes, on the pastures or the rocky heights, floating in the current of the streams, or traversing untrodden snows, in the day at the chase, and as evening closes, in solitude fingering his flute, seen and heard by shepherds, alone or with his dancing train, is to be met the horned and goat-footed, the sunny smiling Pan. Thus conceived, the world has become less terrible, because more familiar. All that was incomprehensible, all that was obscure and dark, has now been seized and bodied forth in form, so that everywhere man is confronted no longer with blind and unintelligible force, but with spiritual beings moved by like passions with himself. The gods, it is true, were capricious and often hostile to his good, but at least they had a nature akin to his. If they were angry, they might be propitiated; if they were jealous, they might be appeased. The enmity of one might be compensated by the friendship of another. Dealings with them, after all, were not so unlike dealings with men, and at the worst there was always a chance for courage, patience, and wit. Man, in short, by his religion, has been made at home in the world, and that is the first point to seize upon. To drive it home, let us take an illustration from the story of Odysseus. Odysseus, it will be remembered, after the sack of Troy, for 10 years was a wanderer on the seas, by tempest, enchantment, and every kind of danger, detained, as it seemed, beyond hope of return, from the wife and home he had left in Ithaca. The situation is forlorn enough, yet somehow or other beauty in the story predominates over terror, and this, in part at least, because the powers with which Odysseus has to do are not mere forces of nature, blind and indifferent, but spiritual beings who take an interest, for or against, in his fate. The whole story becomes familiar, and, if one may say so, comfortable, by the fact that it is conducted under the control and direction of the gods. Listen, for example, to the Homeric account of the onset of a storm, and observe how it sets one at ease with the elements. Now the Lord, the shaker of the earth, on his way from the Ethiopians, espied Odysseus afar off from the mountains of the Solymi. Even thence he saw him as he sailed over the deep, and he was yet more angered in spirit, and wagging his head, he communed with his own heart. Lo now, it must be that the gods at the last have changed their purpose concerning Odysseus, while I was away among the Ethiopians. And now he is nigh to the Phaeacian land, where it is so ordained that he escape the great issues of the woe which hath come upon him. But methinks that even yet I will drive him far enough in the path of suffering. With that he gathered the clouds, and troubled the waters of the deep, grasping his trident in his hands, and he roused all storms of all manner of winds, and shrouded in clouds the land and sea, and down sped night from heaven. The east wind and the south wind clashed, and the stormy west and the north that is born in the bright air, rolling onward a great wave. The position of the hero is terrible, it is true, but not with the terror of despair. For as it is a god that wrecked him, it may also be a god that will save. If Poseidon is his enemy, Athene he knows is his friend, and all lies, after all, in the hands, or as the Greeks said, on the knees, not of a blind destiny, but of beings accessible to prayer. Let us take another passage from Homer to illustrate the same point. It is the place where Achilles is endeavouring to light the funeral pyre of Patroclus. But because there is no wind, the fire will not catch. What is he to do? What can he do? Nothing, say we, but wait till the wind comes. But to the Greek the winds are persons, not elements. Achilles has only to call and to promise, and they will listen to his voice. And so we are told, fleet-footed noble Achilles had a further thought. Standing aside from the pyre, he prayed to the two winds of north and west, and promised them fair offerings, and pouring large libations from a golden cup, besought them to come, that the corpses might blaze up speedily in the fire, and the wood make haste to be enkindled. Then Iris, when she heard his prayer, went swiftly with the message to the winds. They, within the house of the gusty west wind, were feasting all together at meat, when Iris sped thither, and halted on the threshold of stone. And when they saw her with their eyes, they sprung up, and called to her every one to sit by him. But she refused to sit, and spake her word. "No seat for me. I must go back to the streams of ocean, to the Ethiopians' land, where they sacrifice hecatombs to the immortal gods, that I too may feast at their rites. But Achilles is praying the north wind and the loud west to come, and promising them fair offerings, that ye may make the pyre be kindled whereon lieth Patroclus, for whom all the Achaeans are making moan." She having thus said, departed, and they arose with a mighty sound, rolling the clouds before them. And swiftly they came blowing over the sea, and the wave rose beneath their shrill blast, and they came to deep soiled Troy, and fell upon the pile, and loudly roared the mighty fire. So all night drave they the flame of the pyre together, blowing shrill. And all night fleet Achilles, holding a two-handled cup, drew wine from a golden bowl, and poured it forth, and drenched the earth, calling upon the spirit of hapless Patroclus. As a father waileth when he burneth the bones of his son new married, whose death is woe to his hapless parents, so wailed Achilles, as he burnt the bones of his comrade, going heavily round the burning pile with many moans. But at the hour when the morning star goeth forth to herald light upon the earth, the star that saffron-mantled dawn cometh after, and spreadeth over the salt sea, then grew the burning faint, and the flame died down, and the winds went back again to betake them home over the Thracian main, and it roared with a violent swell. Then the son of Peleus turned away from the burning, and lay down wearied, and sweet sleep leapt on him. The exquisite beauty of this passage, even in translation, will escape no lover of poetry. And it is a beauty which depends on the character of the Greek religion, on the fact that all that is unintelligible in the world, all that is alien to man, has been drawn, as it were, from its dark retreat, clothed in radiant form, and presented to the mind as a glorified image of itself. Every phenomenon of nature, night and rosy-fingered dawn, earth and sun, winds, rivers and seas, sleep and death, all have been transformed into divine and conscious agents, to be propitiated by prayer, interpreted by divination, and comprehended by passions and desires, identical with those which stir and control mankind. End of chapter 1, section 2. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Section 3 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 1, section 3. Greek Religion, an Interpretation of the Human Passions. And as with the external world, so with the world within. The powers of nature were not the only ones felt by man to be different from and alien to himself. There were others, equally strange, dwelling in his own heart, which, though in a sense they were part of him, yet he felt to be not himself, which came upon him and possessed him without his choice and against his will. With these too he felt the need to make himself at home, and these too, to satisfy his need, he shaped into creatures like himself. To the whole range of his inner experience he gave definition and life, presenting it to himself in a series of spiritual forms. In Aphrodite, mother of Eros, he incarnated the passion of love, placing in her broidered girdle love and desire of loving converse that steals the wits even of the wise. In Ares he embodied the lust of war. In Athene, wisdom; in Apollo, music and the arts. The pangs of guilt took shape in the conception of avenging furies, and the very prayers of the worshipper sped from him in human form, wrinkled and blear-eyed, with halting pace, in the rear of punishment. Thus the very self of man he set outside himself, the powers so intimate and yet so strange that swayed him from within, he made familiar by making them distinct, converted their shapeless terror into the beauty of visible form, and by merely presenting them thus to himself in a guise that was immediately understood, set aside, if he could not answer, the haunting question of their origin and end. Here then is at least a partial reply to our question as to the effect of a belief in the gods on the feeling of the Greek. To repeat the phrase once more, it made him at home in the world. The mysterious powers that controlled him it converted into beings like himself, and so gave him heart and breathing space, shut in as it were from the abyss by this shining host of fair and familiar forms, to turn to the interests and claims of the passing hour an attention undistracted by doubt and fear. End of chapter 1, section 3. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Section 4 of the Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 1, section 4. Greek Religion, the Foundation of Society. But this relation to the world of nature is only one side of man's life. More prominent and more important at a later stage of his development is his relation to society. And here too in Greek civilisation a great part was played by religion. For the Greek gods, we must remember, were not purely spiritual powers, to be known and approached only in the heart, by prayer. They were beings in human form, like, though superior, to ourselves, who passed a great part of their history on earth, intervened in the affairs of men, furthered or thwarted their undertakings, begat among them sons and daughters, and followed from generation to generation the fortunes of their children's children. Between them and mankind there was no impassable gulf. From Heracles, the son of Zeus, was descended the Dorian race, the Ionians from Ion, son of Apollo. Every family, every tribe traced back its origin to a hero, and these heroes were children of the gods, and deities themselves. Thus were the gods, in the most literal sense, the founders of society. From them was derived, even physically, the unit of the family and the race. And the whole social structure raised upon that natural basis was necessarily penetrated through and through by the spirit of religion. We must not therefore be misled by the fact that there was no church in the Greek state, to the idea that the state recognised no religion. On the contrary, religion was so essential to the state, so bound up with its whole structure, in general and in detail, that the very conception of a separation between the powers was impossible. If there was no separate church, in our sense of the term, as an independent organism within the state, it was because the state, in one of its aspects, was itself a church, and derived its sanction, both as a whole and in its parts, from the same gods who controlled the physical world. Not only the community as a whole, but all its separate minor organs were under the protection of patron deities. The family centred in the hearth, where the father, in his capacity of priest, offered sacrifice and prayer to the ancestors of the house. The various corporations into which families were grouped, the local divisions for the purpose of taxation, elections, and the like, derived a spiritual unity from the worship of a common God. And finally, the all-embracing totality of the state itself was explained and justified to all its members by the cult of the special protecting deity to whom its origin and prosperous continuance were due. The sailor who saw, on turning the point of Sunium, the tip of the spear of Athene glittering on the Acropolis, beheld in a type the spiritual form of the state. Athene and Athens were but two aspects of the same thing, and the statue of the goddess of wisdom dominating the city of the arts may serve to sum up for us the ideal of that marvellous corporate life, where there was no ecclesiastical religion only because there was no secular state. Regarded from this point of view, we may say that the religion of the Greeks was the spiritual side of their political life, and we must add that in one respect their religion pointed the way to a higher political achievement than they were ever able to realise in fact. One fatal defect of the Greek civilisation, as is familiar to students of their history, was the failure of the various independent city-states to coalesce into a single harmonious whole. But the tendency of religion was to obviate this defect. We find, for example, that at one time or another federations of states were formed to support in common the cult of some god. And one cult in particular there was, that of the Delphian Apollo, whose influence on political no less than on religious life was felt as far as, and even beyond, the limits of the Greek race. No colony could be founded, no war hazarded, no peace confirmed, without the advice and approval of the god, whose cult was thus at once a religious centre for the whole of Greece, and a forecast of a political unity that should coordinate into a whole her chaos of conflicting states. The religion of the Greeks being thus, as we have seen, the presupposition and bond of their political life, we find its sanction extended at every point to custom and law. The persons of heralds, for example, were held to be under divine protection. Treaties between states and contracts between individuals were confirmed by oath. The vengeance of the gods was invoked upon infringers of the law. National assemblies and military expeditions were inaugurated by public prayers. The whole of corporate life, in short, social and political, was so embraced and bathed in an idealising element of ritual that the secular and religious aspects of the state must have been as inseparable to a Greek in idea as we know them to have been in constitution. End of chapter 1, section 4. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 1, section 5 of The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 1, section 5. Religious festivals. For it was in ritual and art, not in propositions, that the Greek religion expressed itself. And in this respect it was closer to the Roman Catholic than to the Protestant branch of the Christian faith. The plastic genius of the race, that passion to embody ideas in form, which was at the root, as we saw, of their whole religious outlook, drove them to enact for their own delight, in the most beautiful and telling forms, the whole conception they had framed of the world and of themselves. The changes of the seasons, with the toil they exact and the gifts they bring, the powers of generation and destruction, the bounty or the rigours of the earth, and on the other hand the order and operations of social phenomena, the divisions of age and sex, of function and of rank in the state, all these took shape and came as it were to self-consciousness in a magnificent series of publicly ordered fetes. So numerous were these, and so diverse in their character, that it would be impossible, even if it were desirable in this place, to give any general account of them. Our purpose will be better served by a description of two, selected from the calendar of Athens, and typical, the one of the relations of man to nature, the other of his relation to the state. The festivals we have chosen are those known as the Anthesteria and the Panathenaia. The Anthesteria was held at that season of the year when, as Pindar sings, in an ode composed to be sung upon the occasion, "The chamber of the hours is opened, and the blossoms hear the voice of the fragrant spring, when violet clusters are flung upon the lap of earth, and chaplets of roses braided in the hair, when the sound of the flute is heard, and choirs chanting hymns to Semele." On the natural side, the festival records the coming of spring and the fermenting of last year's wine. On the spiritual, its centre is Dionysus, who not only was the god of wine, but, according to another legend, symbolised in his fate the death of the year in winter and its rebirth at spring. The ceremonies open with a scene of abandoned jollity. Servants and slaves are invited to share in the universal revel. The school holidays begin, and all the place is alive with the bustle and fun of a great fair. Bargaining, peep shows, conjuring, and the like, fill up the hours of the day, and towards evening the holiday makers assemble, garlanded and crowned, in preparation for the great procession. The procession takes place by torchlight. The statue of Dionysus leads the way, and the revellers follow and swarm about him, in carriages or on foot, costumed as Hours or Nymphs or Bacchae in the train of the god of wine. The destination is the temple of the god, and there sacrifice is performed with the usual accompaniment of song and dance, the whole closing with a banquet and a drinking contest, similar to those in vogue among the German students. Aristophanes has described the scene for us. Couches, tables, cushions and coverlets for mattresses, dancing and singing girls for mistresses, plum cake and plain, comfits and caraways, confectionery, fruits preserved and fresh, relishes of all sorts, hot things and bitter, savouries and sweets, broiled biscuits and what not, flowers and perfumes and garlands, everything. And in the midst of this, the signal given by the trumpet, the simultaneous draught of wine, and the prize adjudged to the man who is the first to empty his cup. Thus ends the first phase of the festival. So far all has been mirth and revelry, but now comes a sudden change of tone. Dionysus, god of wine though he be, has also his tragic aspect. Of him too there is recorded a descent into hell, and to the glad celebration of the renewal of life in spring succeeds a feast in honour of the dead. The ghosts, it is supposed, come forth to the upper air. Every doorpost is smeared with pitch to keep off the wandering shades, and every family sacrifices to its own departed. Nor are the arts forgotten. A musical festival is held, and competing choirs sing and dance in honour of the god. Such, so far as our brief and imperfect records enable us to trace it, was the ritual of a typical Greek festival. With the many questions that might be raised as to its origin and development, we need not concern ourselves at present. What we have to note is the broad fact, characteristic of the genius of the Greeks, that they have taken the natural emotions excited by the birth of spring, and by connecting them with the worship of Dionysus, have given them expression and form, so that what in its origin was a mere burst of primitive animal spirits is transmuted into a complex and beautiful work of art, the secret springs and fountains of physical life flowing into the forms of a spiritual symbol. It is this that is the real meaning of all ceremonial, and this that the Greeks, better than any other people, understood. Their religion, one may almost say, consisted in ritual, and to attempt to divide the inner from the outer world would be to falsify from the beginning its distinctive character. Let us pass to our second illustration, the great city festival of Athens. In the Anthesteria it was a moment of nature that was seized and idealised. Here, in the Panathenaia, it is the forms of social life, its distinctions within its embracing unity, that are set forth in their interdependence as functions of a spiritual life. In this great national fete, held every 4 years, all the higher activities of Athenian life were ideally displayed. Contests of song, of lyre and of flute, foot and horse races, wrestling, boxing, and the like, military evolutions of infantry and horse, Pyrrhic dances, symbolic of attack and defence in war, mystic chants of women, and choruses of youths, the whole concentring and discharging itself in that great processional act, in which, as it were, the material forms of society became transparent, and the whole moved on, illumined and visibly sustained by the spiritual soul, of which it was the complete and harmonious embodiment. Of this procession we have still in the frieze of the Parthenon a marble transcript. There we may see the life of ancient Athens moving in stone, from the first mounting of their horses by isolated youths, like the slow and dropping prelude of a symphony, on to the thronged and trampling ranks of cavalry, past the antique chariots reminiscent of Homeric war, and the marching band of flutes and zithers, by lines of men and maidens bearing sacrificial urns, by the garlanded sheep and oxen destined for sacrifice, to where, on turning the corner that leads to the eastern front, we find ourselves in the presence of the Olympian gods themselves, enthroned to receive the offering of a people's life. And if to this marble representation we add the colour it lacks, the gold and silver of the vessels, the purple and saffron robes, if we set the music playing and bid the oxen low, if we gird our living picture with the blaze of an August noon, and crown it with the Acropolis of Athens, we may form a conception, better perhaps than could otherwise be obtained, of what religion really meant to the citizen of a state whose activities were thus habitually symbolised in the cult of its patron deity. Religion, to him, clearly, could hardly be a thing apart, dwelling in the internal region of the soul, and leaving outside, untouched by the light of the ideal, the whole business and complexity of the material side of life. To him it was the vividly present and active soul of his corporate existence, representing in the symbolic forms of ritual the actual facts of his experience. What he re-enacted periodically in ordered ceremony was but the drama of his daily life, so that, as we said before, the state in one of its aspects was a church, and every layman, from one point of view, a priest. The question, what did a belief in the gods really mean to the Greek, has now received at least some sort of answer. It meant, to recur to our old phrase, that he was made at home in the world. In place of the unintelligible powers of nature, he was surrounded by a company of beings like himself, and these beings, who controlled the physical world, were also the creators of human society. From them were descended the heroes who founded families and states, and under their guidance and protection cities prospered and throve. Their histories were recounted in innumerable myths, and these again were embodied in ritual. The whole life of man, in its relations both to nature and to society, was conceived as derived from and dependent upon his gods, and this dependence was expressed and brought vividly home to him in a series of religious festivals. Belief in the gods was not to him so much an intellectual conviction as a spiritual atmosphere in which he moved, and to think it away would be to think away the whole structure of Greek civilisation. End of chapter 1, section 5. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Section 6 of The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 1, section 6. The Greek conception of the relation of man to the gods. Admitting, however, that all this is true, admitting the place of religion in Greek life, do we not end, after all, in a greater puzzle than we began with? For this, it may be said, whatever it may be, is not what we mean by religion. This, after all, is merely a beautiful way of expressing facts, a translation, not an interpretation of life. What we mean by religion is something very different to that, something which concerns the relation of the soul to God, the sense of sin, for example, and of repentance and grace. The religion of the Greeks, we may admit, did something for them which our religion does not do for us. It gave intelligible and beautiful form to those phenomena of nature which we can only describe as manifestations of energy. It expressed in a ritual of exquisite art those corporate relations which we can only enunciate in abstract terms. But did it perform what, after all, it may be said, is the true function of religion? Did it touch the conscience as well as the imagination and intellect? To this question we may answer at once, broadly speaking, no. It was, we might say, a distinguishing characteristic of the Greek religion that it did not concern itself with the conscience at all. The conscience, in fact, did not yet exist, to enact that drama of the soul with God which is the main interest of the Christian, or at least of the Protestant faith. To bring this point home to us, let us open the Pilgrim's Progress and present to ourselves in its most vivid colours the position of the English Puritan. Now I saw upon a time, when he was walking in the fields, that he was, as he was wont, reading in his book, and greatly distressed in his mind. And as he read, he burst out, as he had done before, crying, "What shall I do to be saved?" I looked then, and saw a man named Evangelist coming to him, and asked, "Wherefore dost thou cry?" He answered, "Sir, I perceive by the book in my hand that I am condemned to die, and after that to come to judgment, and I find that I am not willing to do the first, nor able to do the second." Then said Evangelist, "Why not willing to die, since this life is attended with so many evils?" The man answered, "Because I fear that this burden that is upon my back will sink me lower than the grave, and I shall fall into Tophet. And, sir, if I be not fit to go to prison, I am not fit to go to judgment, and from thence to execution, and the thoughts of these things makes me cry." Then said Evangelist, "If this be thy condition, why standest thou still?" He answered, "Because I know not whither to go." Then he gave him a parchment roll, and there was written within, "Fly from the wrath to come." The whole spirit of the passage transcribed, and of the book from which it is quoted, is as alien as can be to the spirit of the Greeks. To the Puritan, the inward relation of the soul to God is everything. To the average Greek, one may say broadly, it was nothing. It would have been at variance with his whole conception of the divine power. For the gods of Greece were beings essentially like man, superior to him not in spiritual nor even in moral attributes, but in outward gifts, such as strength, beauty, and immortality. And as a consequence of this, his relations to them were not inward and spiritual, but external and mechanical. In the midst of a crowd of deities, capricious and conflicting in their wills, he had to find his way as best he could. There was no knowing precisely what a god might want. There was no knowing what he might be going to do. If a man fell into trouble, no doubt he had offended somebody, but it was not so easy to say whom or how. If he neglected the proper observances, no doubt he would be punished, but it was not everyone who knew what the proper observances were. Altogether it was a difficult thing to ascertain or to move the will of the gods, and one must help oneself as best one could. The Greek accordingly helped himself by an elaborate system of sacrifice and prayer and divination, a system which had no connection with an internal spiritual life, but the object of which was simply to discover, and if possible to effect, the divine purposes. This is what we meant by saying that the Greek view of the relation of man to the gods was mechanical. The point will become clearer by illustration. End of chapter 1, section 6. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Section 7 of The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 1, section 7. Divination, omens, oracles. Let us take first a question which much exercised the Greek mind: the difficulty of forecasting the future. Clearly, the notion that the world was controlled by a crowd of capricious deities, swayed by human passions and desires, was incompatible with the idea of fixed law. But on the other hand, it made it possible to suppose that some intimation might be had from the gods, either directly or symbolically, of what their intentions and purposes really were. And on this hypothesis we find developed quite early in Greek history a complex art of divining the future by signs. The flight of birds and other phenomena of the heavens, events encountered on the road, the speech of passers by, or most important of all, the appearance of the entrails of the victims sacrificed, were supposed to indicate the probable course of events. And this art, already mature in the time of the Homeric poems, we find flourishing throughout the historic age. Nothing could better indicate its prevalence and its scope than the following passage from Aristophanes, where he ridicules the readiness of his contemporaries to see in everything an omen, or, as he puts it, punning on the Greek word, a bird. "On us you depend," sings his chorus of birds. "On us you depend, and to us you repair for counsel and aid when a marriage is made, a purchase, a bargain, a venture in trade, unlucky or lucky, whatever has struck ye, an ox or an ass that may happen to pass, a voice in the street, or a slave that you meet, a name or a word by chance overheard, you deem it an omen, and call it a bird." Aristophanes, of course, is jesting, but how serious and important this art of divination must have appeared even to the most cultivated Athenians may be gathered from a passage of the tragedian Aeschylus, where he mentions it as one of the benefits conferred by Prometheus on mankind, and puts it on a level with the arts of building, metal making, sailing, and the like, and the sciences of arithmetic and astronomy. And if any one were dissatisfied with this method of interpretation by signs, he had a directer means of approaching the gods. He could visit one of the oracles, and consult the deity at first hand about his most trivial and personal family affairs. Some of the questions put to the oracle at Dodona have been preserved to us, and very curious they are. "Who stole my cushions and pillow?" asks one bereaved householder. Another wants to know whether it will pay him to buy a certain house and farm. Another, whether sheep farming is a good investment. Clearly, the god was not above being consulted on the meanest affairs, and his easy accessibility must have been some compensation for his probable caprice. Nor must it be supposed that this phase of the Greek religion was a superstition confined to individuals. On the contrary, it was fully recognised by the state. No important public act could be undertaken without a previous consultation of omens. More than once, in the clearest and most brilliant period of the Greek civilisation, we hear of military expeditions being abandoned because the sacrifices were unfavourable. And at the time of the Persian invasion, at the most critical moment of the history of Greece, the Lacedaemonians, we are told, came too late to be present at the battle of Marathon, because they thought it unlucky to start until the moon was full. In all this, we have a suggestion of the sort of relation in which the Greek conceived himself to stand to the gods. It is a relation, as we said, external and mechanical. The gods were superior beings who knew, it might be presumed, what was going to happen. Man didn't know, but perhaps he could find out. How could he find out? That was the problem. And it was answered in the way we have seen. There was no question, clearly, of a spiritual relation. All is external, and a similar externality pervades, on the whole, the Greek view of sacrifice and of sin. Let us now turn to consider this point. End of chapter 1, section 7. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Section 8 of The Greek View of Life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 1, Section 8. Sacrifice and Atonement. In Homer, we find that sacrifice is frankly conceived as a sort of present to the gods, for which they were in fairness bound to an equivalent return, and the nature of the bargain is fully recognised by the gods themselves. Hector, says Zeus to Hera, was dearest to the gods of all mortals that are in Ilios. So was he to me at least, for nowise failed he in the gifts I loved. Never did my altar lack seemly feast, drink offering, and the steam of sacrifice, even the honour that falleth to our due. And he concludes that he must intervene to secure the restoration of the body of Hector to his father. The performance of sacrifice, then, ensures favour, and on the other hand, its neglect entails punishment. When Apollo sends a plague upon the Greek fleet, The most natural hypothesis to account for his conduct is that he has been stinted of his due meed of offerings. "Perhaps," says Agamemnon, "the savour of lambs and unblemished goats may appease him." Or again, when the Greeks omit to sacrifice before building the wall around their fleet, they are punished by the capture of their position by the Trojans. The whole relation between man and the gods is of the nature of a contract. If you do your part, I'll do mine; if not, not. That is the tone of the language on either side. The conception is legal, not moral nor spiritual. It has nothing to do with what we call sin and conscience. At a later period, it is true, we find a point of view prevailing which appears at first sight to come closer to that of the Christian. Certain acts, we find, such as murder, for example, were supposed to infect, as with a stain, not only the original offender, but his descendants from generation to generation. Yet even so, the stain, it appears, was conceived to be rather physical than moral, analogous to disease, both in its character and in the methods of its cure. Aeschylus tells us of the earth breeding monsters as a result of the corruption infused by the shedding of blood; and similarly, a purely physical infection tainted the man or the race that had been guilty of crime. And as was the evil, so was the remedy. External acts and observations might cleanse and purge away what was regarded as an external affection of the soul. And we know that in historic times there was a class of men comparable to the mediaeval pardoners, whose profession it was to effect such cures. Plato has described them for us in striking terms. "Mendicant prophets," he says, "go to rich men's doors and persuade them that they have a power committed to them of making an atonement for their sins, or those of their fathers, by sacrifices or charms with rejoicings and games; and they promise to harm an enemy, whether just or unjust, at a small charge; with magic arts and incantations binding the will of heaven, as they say, to do their work; and they produce a host of books written by Musaeus and Orpheus, who were children of the moon and the muses, that is what they say, according to which they perform their ritual, and persuade not only individuals but whole cities that expiations and atonements for sin may be made by sacrifices and amusements which fill a vacant hour." How far is all this from the Puritan view of sin? How far from the Christian of the Pilgrim's Progress, with the burden on his back? To measure the distance we have only to attend, with this passage in our mind, a meeting, say, of the Salvation Army. We shall then perhaps understand better the distinction between the popular religion of the Greeks and our own, between the conception of sin as a physical contagion to be cured by external rites, and the conception of it as an affection of the conscience which only grace can expel. In the one case, the fact that a man was under the taint of crime would be borne in upon him by actual misfortune from without, by sickness, or failure in business, or some other of the troubles of life; and he would ease his mind and recover the spring of hope by performing certain ceremonies and rites. In the other case, his trouble is all inward. He feels that he is guilty in the sight of God, and the only thing that can relieve him is the certainty that he has been forgiven, assured him somehow or other from within. The difference is fundamental, and important to bear in mind if we would form a clear conception of the Greek view of life. End of chapter 1, section 8. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. 1, section 9 of the Greek view of life by Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 1, section 9. Guilt and Punishment. It must not be supposed, however, that the popular superstition described by Plato, however characteristic it may be of the point of view of the Greeks, represents the highest reach of their thought on the subject of guilt. No profounder utterances are to be found on this theme than those of the great poets and thinkers of Greece, who, without rejecting the common beliefs of their time, transformed them by the insight of their genius into a new and deeper significance. Specially striking in this connection is the poetry of the tragedian Aeschylus, and it will be well worth our while to pause for a moment and endeavour to realise his position. Guilt and its punishment is the constant theme of the dramas of Aeschylus, and he has exhausted the resources of his genius in the attempt to depict the horror of the avenging powers, who under the name of the Erinyes or Furies persecute and torment the criminal. Their breath is foul with the blood on which they feed. From their rheumy eyes a horrible humour drops. Daughters of night, and clad in black, they fly without wings. God and man and the very beasts shun them. Their place is with punishment and torture, mutilation, stoning and breaking of necks. And into their mouth the poet has put words which seem to breathe the very spirit of the Jewish scriptures. Come now, let us preach to the sons of men. Yea, let us tell them of our vengeance. Yea, let us all make mention of justice. Whoso showeth hands that are undefiled, lo, he shall suffer naught of us for ever, but shall go unharmed to his ending. But if he hath sinned, like unto this man, and covereth hands that are blood-stained, then is our witness true to the slain man. And we sue for the blood, sue and pursue for it, so that at the last there is payment. Even so 'tis written, O sentence sure, upon all that wild in wickedness dip hand in the blood of their birth, in the fount of their flowing, so shall he pine until the grave receive him, to find no grace even in the grave. Sing then the spell, sisters of hell, chant him the charm, mighty to harm, binding the blood, madding the mood. Such the music that we make. Quail, ye sons of man, and quake, bow the heart, and bend, and break. This is our ministry, marked for us from the beginning. This is our gift, and our portion apart, and our Godhead. Ours, ours only forever. Darkness, robes of darkness, a robe of terror forever. Ruin is ours, ruin and wreck, when to the home murder hath come, making to cease innocent peace. Then at his beck follow we in, follow the sin, and we hold to the end when we begin. There is no poetry more sublime than this, none more penetrated with the sense of moral law. But still it is wholly Greek in character. The theme is not really the conscience of the sinner, but the objective consequence of his crime. Blood calls for blood is the poet's text. A man, he says, must pay for what he does. The tragedy is the punishment of the guilty, not his inward sense of sin. Orestes, in fact, who is the subject of the drama with which we are concerned, in a sense was not a sinner at all. He had killed his mother, it is true, but only to avenge his father whom she had murdered, and at the express bidding of Apollo. So far is he from feeling the pangs of conscience that he constantly justifies his act. He suffers not because he has sinned, but because he is involved in the curse of his race. For generations back the house of Atreus had been tainted with blood, murder had called for murder to avenge it, and Orestes, the last descendant, caught in the net of guilt, found that his only possibility of right action lay in a crime. He was bound to avenge his father, the god Apollo had enjoined it, and the avenging of his father meant the murder of his mother. What he commits then is a crime, but not a sin, and so it is regarded by the poet. The tragedy, as we have said, centres round an external objective law. Blood calls for blood. But that is all. Of the internal drama of the soul with God, the division of the man against himself, the remorse, the repentance, the new birth, the giving or withholding of grace, of all this, the essential content of Christian Protestantism, not a trace in the clear and concrete vision of the Greek. The profoundest of the poets of Hellas, dealing with the darkest problem of guilt, is true to the plastic genius of his race. The spirit throws outside itself the law of its own being. By objective external evidence it learns that doing involves suffering, and its moral conviction comes to it only when forced upon it from without by a direct experience of physical evil. Of Aeschylus, the most Hebraic of the Hellenes, It is as true as of the average Greek, that, in the Puritan meaning of the phrase, he had no sense of sin; and even in treating of him, we must still repeat what we said at the beginning, that the Greek conception of the relation of man to the gods is external and mechanical, not inward and spiritual. Chapter 1, Section 9. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey.